This video is going to be practical and it's going to focus on how to create the descriptive statistics that we've already covered in the previous video in Excel using your pivot tables and basic formulae and shortcuts that we've already covered in the previous session as well. The data that we're going to be using in this video is the report data. So if you haven't already downloaded from the link in the description below. The data that we're using for this session is anonymized marks data. So if you open the Excel dataset that is linked in the description, you'll see that it shows different learners. And for each learner, it gives what grade they're in, the term, all of these marks are term 4 marks, and what subject it is, and what mark they got for that subject. So this is the data we're going to be using. Chris is going to show you how we can then put this data into a pivot table in order to answer these questions. The first question that we're going to look at is we're going to investigate or explore the grade 9 mathematics and the natural sciences mark.
So we're going to use a pivot table to compare the maths grade 9 versus the natural science grade 9. One important part of this data is in SASAMS, this is the anonymized SASAMS data. A learner is only unique within a school. So it could be that if you only use the learner ID data, that there are more learners with the same ID. That's why it's important to concatenate or to combine the EMIS number with the learner ID number. And that's what we have done here in column D. This is just a concatenation or a combination of the EMIS number and the learner ID. And that gives you this unique ID. And we would need this unique ID when we create the pivot table. So I'm going to create a pivot table now for maths grade 9 and natural science grade 9. So it's Control A to select the entire data set, insert, pivot table, and OK. Then we get this screen where we have on the left, I'm going to build the pivot table, and on the right, we have the detail or the information to build the pivot table. So I want to look at the performance of each learner. In this case, I'm going to use the unique ID. So that's each learner, and I want to look at the performance of each learner within maths and natural science. So I use my subject as a column in this case, and then filter that with here. You can see the filter in the columns area, and I want to use, and I deselect all the subjects, and I only want to look at first maths grade 9. And so if you scroll down, you can see that's maths grade 9. So I select that, and then natural science, also natural sciences grade 9. So those are the only two subjects that I want to compare, and then using descriptives or using the summary stats to do that. So I'm going to take for the value, I'm going to use the mark variable. So this gives us the performance of each of the learners for grade 9 for maths versus 9. Now I'm going to work out, like we showed you in the summary statistics. I'm going to use a few of these summary statistics, and so I want to use the mean or the average, the minimum, the maximum, the median, and the standard deviation. And I want to do that for maths, and I want to do it for natural science. So like in Excel, it's equal to an average. In Excel, if I start with A, it gives me all the options that starts with an A, B, E, and what I want to use, the formula that I want to use here, or the command, is average, and I use my tab key. So the reason why I use the tab key, because then Excel puts in all the brackets for me, and it gets the formula right for me to put in the information. So it's the tab key average, and then I go to the start of the data that I want to use, and in this case it's the maths grade 9. So I go to the first one, and then I want to select all the data, which is shift control arrow down, and it jumps only to the first blank. So I continue going with shift control arrow down until I reach the end, and I don't want to include the total. That's very important. So not to include the total, I keep the shift key down and then hit the arrow up once. You can see now I don't have the total included, and then I can simply hit enter. If I scroll up, you can see that's the average for maths. And the same for the min is equal to, the formula is just min. The tab again, the same. I can shift control arrow down until the end and then enter. Once you understand the formula, it is just easy to continue. The max, the tab key, start with the first one and then shift control to select all of them. Don't include the total and then enter. The same with median, it's equal to median. The tab key, shift control, and because there are blanks in this data, you need to continue until the end and then enter. And then the last one is the standard deviation. The standard deviation that I want to use is this one that is just STDEV. I select then that one and hit my tab key. You need to start with the first one and then shift control will select the range that I want to use and then enter. And because I have two adjacent columns, I don't have to repeat all that. Now all that I can do is, and Excel is a reference language. I don't have to repeat the things that I did in the previous exactly in the same position. So if I highlight this and I simply copy this formula over, and this is exactly the same that I did in here. Now you can compare just using your measures or your summary statistics. You can now compare the performance of maths versus the performance of natural sciences in the fourth term for the grade 9s.
Okay, so using this table that Chris has just set up, we've just made the titles bold and adjusted some of the decimal places. This can now, rather than just scrolling through all of the mark data, which wouldn't give us a very clear picture of what's going on, these statistics over here give us a little bit of an indication of the difference between learners' maths and their natural sciences marks in grade 9. So the maths marks on average are lower than the natural sciences, and by quite a bit. What we can also tell is that the lowest mark in both is 0. We would have to just check if that was the missing data or learners who were absent and had a mark of 0 recorded, or if that is actually learners getting 0. And then we can also see that the maximum mark in maths is higher than for natural sciences. So even though the average in maths, so learners on the whole do worse in maths than natural sciences, there's a learner at least who was a top performer in maths compared to natural science. One big difference between the two, because you can see that the standard deviation is roughly similar. So the marks in maths and natural sciences don't vary that much differently, although they are relative to different means. So the maths mark is lower. So on the whole, they are distributed in a similar way, but lower than for natural sciences. But a big difference is the median. So the median, remember, is that 50% of the learners got above that mark, 50% of the learners got below that mark. For maths, we can see that it's 33%. For natural science, the median is 40%, which is showing us that maths has a lot more learners who are achieving very poorly, so 33% or below, compared to natural sciences, where fewer learners are getting less than 33%. Chris is now going to show you a way to use two pivot tables in order to look at summary statistics, specifically with reference to the grade 10 mathematics and the mathematical literacy marks.
So before I go on to the next pivot table, I first want to make sure that I change the default naming convention of Excel from sheet 1. And here I'm simply going to write measures or descriptives. This is what we did in this sheet, was looking at the different summary statistics or descriptives. So what I want to do now is I want to show you how to compare the Maths grade 10 versus the Maths Lit grade 10. And as you can see, it's different learners taking those two different subjects. So I want to use two pivot tables on the same sheet. So for the first time, I'm going to show you that. So every time I start with my data, then insert, pivot table, and OK. I'm first going to do the pivot table for grade 10 maths. So again, I look at the performance of individual learners. So I use my unique ID to do that. And then again, and this time around, I'm going to not use my subject as a column, but I'm going to use my subject as a filter. So I want to use my subject as a filter, and I want to look at maths grade 10 only. So I'm going to use my maths grade 10 as a filter. And this pivot table is now only for maths grade 10. I put in my mark as a value. And this is the performance, and you can see this is the performance of learners for grade 10 maths only. And I also want to show you a quick way to copy a pivot table. And that's important that you know that. So let me first do it the long way. And to do it the long way is I always start the pivot table, and I just need to remember I want to put the second pivot table in sheet 2. But I always start the pivot table with the data. Select all the data and insert and pivot table. But this time around, I just don't take Excel's default selection. Instead of saying on a new sheet, I say no, I want to put it on an existing sheet. So if I now go and say on the existing sheet, then I need to tell Excel in which existing sheet I want to put it and where. So I click on there, then go to sheet 2 and say I want to put it right here. That's where I want to put it, and Excel gives you the address to do that. And if I now go and say, okay, so this pivot table that I'm going to build is now for another pivot table. So if I click in this one, it is this field list. If I click on this one on the left, it is then this field list. But that's a long way to do that. There's a way quicker and safer and easier way to do that. So I'm going to delete this pivot table by simply highlight all of that and say delete. So that is now gone. So what I want to do, in fact, is to copy this pivot table and paste it right here next to it. And to do that, I need to copy this entire pivot table like that. And then I say copy. And then the important part is if I need to go on the same level as the other one and right click and then simply say, and not the values, I need to use this first copy option and say paste, and there you can see it. Now I have two pivot tables exactly the same. This one is for math and this one is for math. It's exactly the same. But I can use now my filter to differentiate between the two. I can use my filter, and I want to, instead of maths grade 10, I want to have math lit grade 10. And you can see now I have two different pivot tables. The one is for maths, the one is for math lit. Now I want to do my summary statistics, and I'm going to use exactly the same. So I'm just simply going to copy the summary statistics and then paste it here. So now I can do my average for maths, and then I can do my average for math lit. So let's start with this one is for maths. So it's again equal to average, and hit my tab key, go to this, and then shift control arrow down and one up and enter. That was the average. The min is exactly the same. Tab, start with the first value, shift control arrow down and up and enter. Max, tab, go to the first one, shift control arrow down, one up and enter. We go. And the median equal to median. So tab is important. Go to the first one, shift control arrow down, one up and enter. And then the last one is the standard deviation. And you can see I every time start with the equal sign, standard deviation. And this is the one I want to use. Tab. First select the first one, shift control arrow down, one up and enter. There we go. And that gives us the summary statistics for maths. I can't unfortunately just copy it over because it is not, it's different, might be different learners. and different learners there. So I can't just copy it over. So I'm going to do that for Math Lit also separately and work that out Math Lit. Again, I need to do it's equal to average, but this time around, this time around, I select this range and not that range. So that's why I use two separate pivot tables, because all these learners do different subjects. The learners here are different from the learners in Math Lit in grade 9. So average, and then shift control arrow down and one up and enter. And the min is equal to min tab. I always need to go to the start, shift control arrow and up. The max equal to max tab. Start with the selection, one up and enter. In the median, tab, selection and enter. Then the last one is the standard deviation. Tab, make sure you always start at the beginning, enter, shift control and one up and enter. And that gives you the summary statistics for Math versus Math Lit.
Okay, so once again, I'll just reduce the number of decimal places just so that it's easier to read, and I'll zoom in. So from these summary statistics of the grade 10 achievement in maths and maths literacy, what we can tell just by these 10 numbers, we can see that on average, achievement in maths lit is higher than in maths, but the maths achievement goes up to a higher value and it doesn't go as low. Maths lit goes all the way to 0, but it doesn't go quite as high as the maths. And then if we look at the median, what this is telling us, it's further evidence that the maths achievement is worse than the maths lit achievement, and that there are a lot more learners who are achieving very low marks, is that half of the learners in maths are getting less than 28%, whereas for maths lit, that number is 32. Another thing that this shows us, and this isn't too surprising given that the maths goes to a higher number as well, but it says the standard deviation for maths is higher than for maths lit. So this is telling us that the mathematics marks are more spread out from its mean, from that 31, than the maths lit marks are spread out from its mean. The maths more spread, there's more high achievers and more low achievers, and there's also a lot of very low achievement in maths.
So it's important, before I continue to the next part, I want to first rename this sheet. And you can see it's very confusing in Excel if you continue with the default naming convention of Excel, sheet 1, sheet 2, sheet 3. So I just want to give this a proper name. Let's right click and then rename. And in this instance, I want to compare maths underscore with math lit. So what I want to do now is to compare the performance of learners in maths and maths lit. Look at all those who achieved more than 30% in both subjects, maths and maths lit. So to do that, I'm going to go to the original data, my data, and then I want to add a column. And I'm just going to say performance. And I want to use an if statement to look at all the learners perform 30 and 30 plus or the other way. So I'm going to use an if statement. The if statement is just simply equal to, and in Excel it's if, and then the tab. And again, you can see it is ready for me then to put in the command. And in Excel, the if statement is got a statement. And in this case, I want to look at the mark. That's the start of the statement. It starts with a statement. And if that statement is higher and equal to, that is the statement. Now I need to tell Excel what must that be. So I want to look at that higher than and equal to 30. That's the one part of the if statement. The next part of the if statement is separated by a comma, which is the true part. So if it is true, then I want Excel to say yes. That's the true part. And then the false part, again separated with a comma, I want it to be a no. That is just the format or the syntax for the if statement, and then simply say enter. And you can see the 20 is below 30, so that's why it's a no. That's not true. If I just copy this down using my fill handle, I simply double click And you can see the years is higher than 30, 41, but the 24 is less than. So now I want to summarize this using a pivot table. And I'm going to put a pivot table right here to look at the percentage of learners in maths and maths lit achieving 30% and more. So I'm going to be in my data, Control A, insert, pivot table, and this time around I want to put it on the existing sheet and then show Excel, just put that pivot table right here. And if I say OK, and OK, and now I'm ready to go. So I want to look at the subjects, and in this case I only want to look at maths for grade 10, and which is in this case the subject that I want to compare, and then I want to use the maths lit also for grade 10 and say OK. So you can see there now what I want to do is I want to count the number of the yes and the no. So I'm going to use my performance here and put it under columns. So I want to look at the number of learners that obtained more than 30% and the number of learners that obtained less than 30%. So I simply use my unique ID to do the count for me. And you can see that I now have in this data set, this is the number of learners in Maths Lit is 209 more and 1,202 less, and the same in Maths, 583 and 550. So this is just the actual count. But I can look at the percentage of learners obtained less than 30, percentage obtained more than 30. So, and to do that, I need to be inside my pivot table. And in Excel, there's a command for that. So if I'm inside the pivot table and I right click, there is an option, a very important option in the pivot table is this one that says show values as a percentage of row total. You can now see that this is within this row, which in this case is Math Lit, and within this row, in this case, which is Maths grade 10. So in that way, you can change the numbers. I can change it back to numbers. If I simply go and I say right click, show values as, and if I say no calculation, it simply goes back to the numbers again. But in this case, I wanted to show as the values as a percentage of the row total. And here again, I don't like all these decimals. I can change it only to one decimal, or I can get rid of all the decimals in this case.